Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Andrew Lucas and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. Dayworker. No matter how many times I walked into the employment office, I always felt nervous. It was understandable, I guess, especially as my first job ended up with my arms deep inside someone's chest cavity. There's supposed to be a system in place to prevent that, checks and balances and such, but all I know is that my first job was as a 12-year-old heart surgeon. That kind of thing sticks with you. My day began no differently than billions of other workers across the country. Wake up, scarf down a government-mandated nutritious breakfast, specially formulated to ensure physical performance and mental acuity, and then make your way down to the employment office. Most people tried to get to the office first thing in the morning, as everyone knew all the good jobs went early. Once you accepted a work chip, you were required to take the assigned position. It wasn't complicated. Walk in, choose a work chip, and then do a good day's work. By the time I got to the office, there were only a few people milling about the outside doors. They all had their work chips and were waiting for whatever employer had hired them for the day to pick them up. No doubt the employer had pinged them and was waiting for a full load before dispatching a truck. From the looks of them, large muscular men and women, it was probably a day in the fields or some warehouse somewhere that they had to look forward to. None of them looked any happier than I felt. And to top it off, I had a horrible headache and felt like I was coming down with the flu or something. "Hey, Bob," a cheery voice greeted me the moment I stepped into the office. It was Cheryl, a petite blonde caseworker who had been flirting with me for months. There were a few professions that a job chip couldn't prime for you. Athlete and sociologist were two. Cheryl had been working out of this office for years, and while we'd both downloaded high school together, I really didn't know her well. I did know her type, though, and I wasn't interested. "Morning, Miss Rasmussen," I replied as drearily as I felt.
"Please," she giggled. "How many times do I have to tell you it's Cheryl?"
She obviously wasn't getting the hint. "Cheryl. So is there anything left?"
"All business today, Bob," she pouted. "Okay, be that way. Come into assessment room 1 and we'll see what I have for you."
She was trying to be sulky and flirtatious at the same time. Trying being the operative word. At some point, I'd have to bite the bullet and take her out for drinks or something. Perhaps then she'd realize we didn't have anything in common. Either that or we'd end up married with a couple of kids, a dog, and a crippling mortgage. There were no half measures with Cheryl, though we might have to give up one of the kids to make room for the dozen or so cats I was sure she already had at home. "Sure thing, Cheryl. I hope there's something good left." Cheryl held open the door to the small assessment room, half doctor's office, half bureaucratic nightmare, filled as it was with stacks of unfilled paperwork and a half-full examination bed, complete with stirrups. Why the bed was there in the first place was a bit of a mystery, as the work chips were all inserted into the cerebral slot that every North American child had installed in grade school. Cerebral slot, which meant it was inserted into a worker's head and didn't really need a bed, let alone stirrups. The bed in Assessment Room 1 was doubling as a filing cabinet, and judging by the amount of dust on the papers, it had been for some time.
"Have a seat, Bob."
Cheryl moved the stack of papers from the chair in front of her desk to the already overburdened bed. She sidled herself up onto the desk and placed herself provocatively close to the chair she expected me to sit in. Just another day in the office with Cheryl. I tried to avoid making eye contact as I squeezed past her and into the chair. She picked up a small box from the desk and perched herself on the edge of the desk. Inside the box was an assortment of brightly colored chips and a medical instrument that looked like a cross between a digital thermometer and an oversized cribbage board. "Looks like there's a lot of blues in there."
"This late in the day, that's all you can expect, Bob. You know that."
Cheryl smiled as she began snapping the chips into the instrument. Blues were jobs that required a certain amount of physicality: construction work, policing, dance instructor, and the like. Reds required an artistic bend, like painters, surgeons, and such. Yellows needed a certain mathematical aptitude, accountancy, and the like. Greens were performance-oriented, that tied into specific body types, generally giving coordination skills to people who already spent a significant amount of their time sculpting their body to match the needs of these chips. Need a chorus line or a defensive linebacker in a hurry? A green chip could deliver that to order. Then there were the silvers and golds. These were reserved for workers with a very specific type of brain chemistry, more apt for creative thought, architects, and scientists. Silvers and golds paid better than any other color, but only a few lucky workers had brains that could slot them. Blues didn't pay as well as red, and didn't even approach the pay scale of a gold, but it also didn't come with the pressure. Not that my brain chemistry was compatible with a gold chip anyway. It wasn't a gold that I was avoiding. I wasn't turned off by working in a lab or a CAD design desk in some office. It's just that golds were reserved for those workers whose brain structure and chemistry could handle them. Mine couldn't. Work chips were a natural progression for the immersive, interactive, and all-invasive society of the early 21st century. It began with the subtle displacement of resources, like dictionaries and encyclopedias, in favor of interactive online resources. The fact that Google existed at all cut hundreds of hours of research out of millions of student class assignments. It was only a matter of time until an upsurge in biofeedback games like the Wii and PlayStation Connect, interconnectivity, and education collided. Add to that the remarkable advances in brain mapping and intuitive cerebral interfaces, and the wired generation of the 2000s leapfrogged into the 30th century. Interfaces allowed students, cadets, and journeymen to download all the data they needed right into their brains. The limits of human potential returned to the basics, the potential of an individual's body. After all, if you can download the knowledge and abilities of a world-renowned surgeon, but lack the manual dexterity to effectively hold a scalpel, you could hardly function at that level, could you? Same with the construction workers, who required not only the muscular strength to work the high iron or housing site, but were also able to read and understand the blueprints from an intimate perspective, as well as coordinate in real time with their wired-in co-workers. Building a structure and building a structure as a blueprint changes dynamically were two different things. Futurists used to talk about the singularity, the so-called merging of man and machine. Robotics, computers, and humanity working as one. In the end, good old meat and bone turned out to be more economical and even more efficient, especially when a student graduated high school at age 12, downloading their graduate degrees when their brains and bodies stopped developing. Then it was into the workforce and employment offices like this one. It was a gradual change, but eventually society decided that, given the choice, they would always take the world-renowned expert with years of experience over some nobody, no matter how gifted. The technology became so refined that the only limits of a downloaded skill set became the physical limitations of the person downloading them. Employment by body type became the norm. Employers copyrighted and zealously guarded their skill sets, apportioning them out as needed. Why hire and train a permanent workforce when you could train a handful and download them into temps as needed? The employment offices soon followed. So what's left? I asked, trying to look at the chip installer's display. Cheryl looked at the installer and then at me.
Does it matter, Bob?
She sighed. What do you mean? Cheryl put the instrument on the desk and leaned forward, staring into my eyes.
You never show up early enough for the really good reds. It's like you don't want to do anything important with your life.
Now, that was one skill that had never been able to be hard-coded or downloaded into a chip. Sheer, unadulterated bitch. Come on, Cheryl, do we have to do this? Cheryl pouted again, although after all these years, she had to know that that tactic didn't work on me.
I just want you to succeed. It is my job, you know.
I leaned forward and flipped the protective cover off my cerebral implant port, presenting it to her. It was a standard government-issued port, nothing fancy, but serviceable, all that I really needed. No gold headlights or LED lighting for me, just a simple plug with the factory-issued yellow and black caution piping. Of course, it connected directly into my cerebral cortex as well as my automatic system, all the way to my spinal cord. I suppose that was special enough as an example of modern technology, but as every kid in North America had one, it didn't seem that special. What was that old saying about if everyone was special, that nobody was special? I guess I felt that way about my input plug. Cheryl attached an input lead from her machine to my input plug, taking just enough time to sweep my hair out of the way to give me that really creepy feeling. The machine was supposed to sync up with my brain and body's capacity with the available job chips. I tended to get a lot of light office chips, accountancy, call center, cashiers, deliveries, and that type of work. The sort of thing that anyone with an input plug could do. Boring, ordinary, dull work, to be sure. The machine in Cheryl's hand chimed a couple of times. She typed a couple of commands into the machine, and it chimed a half-dozen more times before stopping. She scowled at it and inputted another command, which resulted in a warbling, half-hearted whine, before she rapped it hard with the palm of her hand. I suppose that she had either downloaded a Scottish engineer's skill set this morning, or had no idea that the sensitive electrical device she was pounding on was plugged into my fucking head. Either way, the machine gave a final bleep before flashing a warning symbol and shutting down. "That's odd," she scowled at the machine. "The neurosampler says that your brain is incompatible with all of the chips we have." "I see," I replied, giving her the old stink eye as I carefully pulled the input cord from my skull. It was already half unplugged from the jostling Cheryl had given it. "Probably you have a bit of an infection that's throwing off the interface." "Well, that didn't sound too bad." "Or it's a tumor." And there it was. "I don't think it's a tumor." Cheryl stared at her machine for a few seconds before shaking her head and shutting it down. "You're probably right, Bob, but it's probably best you get it checked out." So it turns out it was a tumor, one of those that are so invasive it doesn't matter how good a chip you slotted, you'd never be able to carve it out. The doctor at the walk-in clinic, who needed a specialist ward when everyone was a specialist, said it was mostly benign, but it was 50-50 whether it would stay that way. He gave me some antibiotics to help with the inflammation around my input port, and we made a couple of follow-up appointments. He was a single father I'd seen around the neighborhood, but never really talked to before. Hell of a way to break the ice. It was a couple of days before I went back to the employment office, and as ever, Cheryl was there to greet me with her predatory smile and roving hands. It wasn't long before I was back in assessment room 1. "So, are you feeling better?" Cheryl asked, moving my hair again. "Much." "I was worried about you." I was tired of playing this game, and the antibiotics the clinic prescribed were putting me a little on edge. It was nothing, just a cold. I lied. Damned if I was going to give her an excuse to fake more sympathy. Bad enough that she thought she was my high school career counselor. Not that the profession had existed for a couple of dozen years, but you get my point. "Well, that's good." Cheryl roughly slotted her machine into my head. Perhaps she was getting the point. The machine beeped and whined a long time before tinging a result. "That's strange," Cheryl muttered. "What's strange?" "Just give me a second." She ran the test a second, and then a third time before finally seeming satisfied with the results. She pulled out a single gold chip from her machine. The chip looked older than any I'd seen before, and featured a prominent band of silver, which I hadn't seen before. It looked a little scuffed, scratched, and peeling in places, a bit beaten around the edges. Probably it had been rattling around in her box for quite some time. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, just looking at the chip. "Well, Bob, it seems you hit the jackpot, Tiger." She was smiling wider than I'd ever seen her smile before. That sinking feeling got worse.
The machine has selected you for a unique opportunity. This is a chip that every employment office has. I've never seen it assigned before. It's a developer chip.
I've heard of these chips before. Everyone had. It contained the skill set of the man who had created the chip system, Johann Vandenberg. Vandenberg was regarded as a modern-day combination of Albert Einstein and Benjamin Franklin, with a touch of Stephen Hawking, all flavored with the worldview of Henry Ford. It was an urban legend that no one had ever qualified to slot one before. After all, who really had the raw ability and creativity to modify or improve on a system that everyone used, and was created by arguably the finest mind ever to grace the planet? It was my worst nightmare. You're kidding.
I don't think so, Bob. The results were pretty clear.
Well, I'd rather have a blue, please. Cheryl looked at me hard. There was no warmth in her gaze. The casual flirtation was over. No doubt her mind was running the numbers on a developer chip's pay scale and her commission. Up until now, she'd let me choose whatever chip I wanted because she was sweet on me. That was over now.
I don't think so, Bob. For whatever reason, the machine wants to give you a developer chip. I suggest you take it.
It has to be a mistake. Run the machine again.
No.
What do you mean, no?
I mean no. You've been skating through here not taking chips you could, and now we've got a payday here.
Now it's we, is it, Cheryl? She slammed the table hard, causing papers to cascade to the floor.
Damn right it's we, you ungrateful little snot. I don't know why the machine selected you, and I don't care. Take the damn chip or by God, I'll make you regret it.
She could, too. A black mark from her, and I wouldn't be allowed into any employment office anywhere in the city. Sure, I could refuse the chip, but was it worth joining the ranks of the unplugged? Those poor bastards who couldn't take an implant because of mental issues, incompatible brain chemistry, or addiction issues? Sure, they could find work as grocery baggers and such, but most just cashed their disability checks and faded away. Cheryl could see my hesitation.
Look, it's not the same thing. You tried your best, but you were only 12. It didn't matter that your hands were ideal for a thoracic surgeon. You were too young.
I realized that, but he died.
You tried your best. You were just a child.
It was too much. The memories came flooding back. The sound of the spreaders cracking the man's ribs apart, the copper smell of blood mingled with the antiseptic smell of a surgical mask meant for an adult, the slick feel of the man's heart pulsing and sliding in my hands as I massaged it, waiting for an adult to arrive and take over. He had been in cardiac arrest when I entered the office. They hadn't been able to get anyone else in fast enough. He died, I whispered. Cheryl sighed, taking both my hands in hers and staring deep into my eyes. Gone was the flirting office cougar. Gone was the greedy bureaucrat. Looking in her eyes, all I saw was a woman who knew the pain I felt, the fear, and the betrayal. I could like this woman.
I know, honey, I know. But it's not the same. No one's going to die.
I guess. She leaned back, knowing she'd won.
Of course not. It's just development work. Like making an iPhone with a larger screen. Simple.
Simple. Right. A few hours later, I'd been picked up limousine and ferried to a lab downtown by a bewildering number of starry-eyed researchers and technicians. They all seemed inordinately impressed by the fact that I'd drawn the coveted developer chip. I hadn't done anything yet, but they were all looking at me like I was Arthur and I'd just pulled Excalibur from the stone. Apparently, this was the first developer chip ever drawn. No one had ever had the appropriate skills or cerebral capacity to slot one. They had a protocol for this situation, which was summed up as, give me a huge check, a room to slot the chip, and then anything I needed. I started with a soda. Now, I sat with a scruffy gold chip in one hand, a nice cold drink in the other, and a 6-digit check, and no idea what to do next. I wasn't stupid. No one had offered me a developer chip in the decade or so I'd been in the workforce. It had to be the tumor affecting my brain chemistry somehow. I didn't feel smarter, just a hell of a lot more nervous. There was no way to back out now. I slipped the chip into my input jack, and my world exploded. Suddenly, I could see everything. It was like the world was connected to me by these multicolor streamers. I could see the invisible spectrum of communication between all the technology in the building and beyond. Huge tunnels of data plunged through the wall in front of me, pouring data into the smart desk the techs had provided me. I ran a hand through the data, and the potential of each small datum changed as I touched it, swirling around my hand before it went off to its final destination. I had no idea what I'd changed. I suppose a genius like Vandenberg would know exactly what he was changing, but not me. I swirled my hands about, creating cascades of data and virtual showers before they flew away on new trajectories. It was fun and slightly overwhelming. I got a little nervous about what I was doing when one of the data particles shot off into one of the streamers which I connected to my input plug, and I felt a shock, like a jolt of electricity. Whatever I'd done, I felt through my nervous system. Perhaps it was time to take this a little more seriously. Concentrating on the data, I isolated a small streamer that wasn't connected to my own brain and looked hard at it. It led to a small Wi-Fi-enabled thermostat mounted on the wall. The device was happily scanning the room and adjusting the temperature in small increments depending on my body's ambient heat, air currents, and the amount of sunlight filtering in through the blinds. I could tell it was looking at my skin surface and changing the airflow and temperature to match it. Huh? I had no idea. I found a lot of similar devices waiting for a response from me in the room. Power sockets idling to read whatever device was plugged into them before adjusting their current to the optimum flow. Light bulbs that read my pupil dilation and adjusted their output to reduce my eye fatigue. Hell, even the doorknob was subtly power-assisted to determine the appropriate resistance to my grip. I suppose I knew all this technology existed, but like most people, never really thought much about it until now. Now that my brain was wired directly into it. It was intimidating. I'm sure there was a user manual to the developer chip, and no doubt all that information was being fed to the parts of my brain where my new tumor lived. Just my luck. I took a moment to look for one rather than just jumping into it blind. Turned out there was a user manual of sorts, and a very interactive one. I could open up virtual windows in the air around me and ask questions, and get answers from those windows. The windows let me ask all sorts of questions, general ones like, how does the city's subway work? Or why do you have to arrive 1 hour early before your flight? And specific ones like, can the federal mint change the face on the $5 bill? Or can I reduce the size of the tax code? I hate tax time. Anyway, the answers were all there, in as much detail as I wanted, with some broad parameters that could be manipulated. Each time I adjusted one parameter, like, say, the timetable for Chicago's inner-city bus schedule, all the other parameters changed. And with each parameter's change, a little voice asked if I was sure, accompanied by a pop-up. I thought that was strange that the help file would be so needy. I guess it was more of a tutorial than anything else. But then the gold chip was very complicated to use and needed a pretty sophisticated interface, and this one was very intuitive. When I brought up the NORAD system, there were hundreds of little pop-ups before I could actually start working on it. That system, more than any, was hard to understand. I moved dozens of little sliders before I got them all where I wanted them. After a while, I got bored with the tutorial and went back to playing with the data flow around me. I reached out to the doorknob and played with the signals flowing through it. The data responded instantly by increasing the torque within the knob so much that it seized the door within its frame. Not a good start, but I persevered and played with the thermostat some, but somehow managed to get that stuck on full, and no manipulation of the data flow could get it back down. I did manage to shut down the air circulation, and that helped some. With that little success, I was encouraged and looked at the power plug, and poking at its data current produced an impressive power surge. I moved on. I played for hours with all the data going through the huge virtual pipeline of data in the middle of the room. I spent a couple of hours flipping through the current, figuring out what the various flows meant. Robotic assemblers, GPS positioning calibrators, transit bus routers, FDA approval systems, and all sorts of weird and wonderful data flowed through this room, connecting every point on the planet. It was intoxicating touching so much data. I knew it would only be a matter of time before I started to understand what the data actually meant, and I could feel the knowledge tickling at the edge of my mind. Every few hours, the room would dispense a meal for me. There was an app for that, and while the selection was a little bland, it was tasty enough. I guess the developers needed isolation to concentrate, and a bunch of prepackaged meals helped with that. Can't say I didn't appreciate the foresight, as I was really enjoying the work now that I had the swing of it. A beer or two would have been nice. I think I was working at it for 3 or 4 days before the techs took a fire axe to the door. I'm late, as usual, but this time it's the lack of any reliable transit that's the culprit. Well, that and the roads still being clogged with traffic accidents, emergency service vehicles, and clouds of smoke. Luckily, I was able to tag along with a group of retro hippies whose busted-up van didn't have a GPS or any type of computer assist and worked just fine. It was still a harried trip, with many of the drivers struggling to control their vehicles manually. Guess their vehicles didn't sync up with the input chips anymore. I'd sympathize more if I had a car, and hitchhiking to the employment office wasn't that different from taking transit, especially now. Today, Cheryl doesn't spend any time on pleasantries, and she hustles me into assessment room 2. The lights are a little bright, the room a little stuffy, and it smells like smoke from what's left of assessment room 1. Still, the office is much better off than thousands of buildings across the country that didn't fare as well. I can see the dim flicker of the fires still burning across the city through the windows' drawn blinds. Cheryl and I don't talk about that, or much of anything. I still come to the office daily, and she still scans my brain. Though the feedback from the developer chip burnt the tumor right out, along with any hope of getting another gold chip offered to me. Though I doubt Cheryl would ever offer me one again, even if she could. Thank you for listening. We love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. We'd like to hear from you and let us know what you think. The best way to do that is to subscribe on our website, untold-tales.com. We want to make sure that we are creating stories and an experience that you're enjoying. So subscribe on our website. That'll put you on our email list. Again, thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.